Picture this. It's 4 in the morning, November 1916, somewhere along the Western Front. The temperature has dropped below freezing. Your fingers are so numb you can barely feel them. Your teeth chatter uncontrollably. And your stomach feels like it's eating itself from the inside out. You haven't had a hot meal in 3 days, maybe 4. You've honestly lost count. The trench mud squelches beneath your boots, and that familiar smell, that mixture of cordite, decay, and human waste, floods your nostrils for the 10,000th time. You're 22 years old, but you feel ancient, broken, like the war has aged you a decade in just a few months. Now here's what most people don't realize about the Great War. We know about the trenches. We know about the artillery barrages and the machine gun fire and the incomprehensible scale of death. But we almost never talk about the daily reality of survival. We don't talk about what kept men going. We don't talk about the rumbling bellies and the desperate hunger that sometimes felt worse than the fear of shell fire. We don't talk about the makeshift alcohol that soldiers brewed in their dugouts, the thick tea that could warm you from the inside out, or the dark humor and wild dreams that helped men maintain their sanity in a landscape of pure hell. Today, we're diving deep into the intimate, untold world of trench life. The stuff the official histories skip over, the stuff that reveals what it actually meant to be human in the most inhuman circumstances imaginable. This isn't just history, this is the story of survival, resilience, and the small things that kept millions of young men alive during the worst conflict the world had ever seen. Let's start with the most basic human need, food. And I want you to understand something right from the start. The food situation in the trenches wasn't just bad. It was catastrophically, devastatingly bad for soldiers living in the front line. The system was broken in almost every conceivable way, and the consequences were utterly brutal. The British Army, despite its reputation for organization and discipline, struggled enormously with feeding its fighting men. Supply lines stretched for miles, sometimes tens of miles. Food had to be transported from supply depots to brigade headquarters, then to battalion headquarters, then distributed to companies, and finally down to individual platoons and squads in the trenches. By the time it arrived, it was often cold, spoiled, or rendered completely inedible by mud, rain, or the filth of trench life. Let's talk about what soldiers actually received. The standard ration for a British infantryman in the trenches was supposed to provide around 2,500 calories per day. That sounds reasonable until you remember that soldiers were doing physically demanding work, operating in freezing conditions, and burning enormous amounts of energy just trying to stay warm. Many military historians and nutritionists who've studied the records estimate that frontline troops were actually consuming far fewer calories than they needed, often by a factor of 30 to 40%. Men were starving while they fought. The rations themselves were a study in monotony and desperation. Bully beef was the primary protein source. This was corned beef that had been canned, sometimes years earlier, and it arrived in small rectangular tins that soldiers had to open with their bayonets or improvised tools. Now, bully beef itself wasn't terrible. It was edible. It had fat content that provided calories, but the psychological impact of eating the same thing over and over, day after day, week after week, month after month, was absolutely crushing. Soldiers developed an intense hatred for it. They called it by various names, most of them unprintable in polite company. One soldier's diary from 1915 described opening a tin of bully beef and finding what appeared to be a perfectly formed rat inside it. Whether this actually happened, or whether it was the hallucination of a starving, exhausted man, we'll never know. But the fact that he believed it was possible tells you everything you need to know about the state of the food supply. Alongside the bully beef came hard biscuits. These were called dog biscuits or hardtack, and they were genuinely rock hard. Soldiers couldn't bite into them directly. They had to either soak them in water or coffee until they softened, or they had to smash them with their rifle butts or rocks. Many men's teeth cracked from trying to bite into these things. Some soldiers developed elaborate techniques for preparing them. They'd crumble the biscuits into a kind of powder and mix them with melted fat or into a stew of some kind. Others would deliberately leave them to get moldy because apparently mold made them easier to eat. That's not a joke. That's a historical record of the desperation these men felt. Then there was the canned jam. Strawberry jam, plum jam, various combinations. This was supposed to provide some vitamins and morale boost, but it was another item that soldiers ate so frequently that many developed an actual physical aversion to it. They couldn't look at it without feeling nauseated. The biscuits and jam combination was so common that soldiers joked it was intended to be eaten together as a kind of primitive sandwich. But the reality was that by the middle years of the war, many men couldn't force themselves to eat both items from the same ration pack. Fresh meat was almost non-existent for frontline troops. Occasionally, soldiers near battalion headquarters might get access to fresh beef or mutton, but this almost never made it to the front lines. The meat would spoil during transport, or it would be kept at battalion level and never distributed further forward. Vegetables were similarly rare. Canned vegetables sometimes appeared in rations, but they were often overcooked mush that bore no resemblance to actual vegetables. Soldiers became obsessed with the idea of fresh food. They dreamed about it. They wrote letters home, begging their families to send care packages with anything fresh. They'd plan elaborate meals in their minds. A soldier's diary from 1916 contains a 4,000-word essay describing the breakfast he'd cook when he got home. Fresh eggs, bacon, toast with butter, hot coffee. He wrote about it in such vivid detail that you can almost smell it through the yellowed pages of the diary. This is where the system of trench raiding and foraging comes in. And this is where the humanity of these soldiers really becomes apparent. Despite the rules and regulations and the threat of court-martial for stealing, men in the trenches developed an elaborate informal economy. They foraged, they traded, they stole from supply dumps, they negotiated with support troops for extra rations, they kept track of who owed them favors, and most importantly, they shared what they had with each other. If one soldier received a care package from home with chocolate or condensed milk or canned fruit, he would share it with his closest friends. It was an unwritten code. In an environment of scarcity and potential death at any moment, small acts of generosity became acts of profound humanity. Men who had nothing else to give still gave what little food they had. Officers, interestingly, received better rations than enlisted men. They had access to the officers' mess, where the food was significantly better, but many officers, not all but many, felt deeply uncomfortable about this disparity and would sometimes skip meals so that more food could be distributed to the men under their command. And then there was the thing that nobody talks about, the cannibalization of rations between units. When one unit suffered massive casualties, their remaining rations would sometimes be redistributed to other units. But the system was chaotic, and often the rations would disappear entirely, consumed by looters and scavengers moving through the rear areas. Supply officers developed increasingly elaborate systems to track rations, but it was almost impossible to maintain control over the food supply during the chaos of active combat operations. Now let's talk about what soldiers tried to do to supplement their rations. In quiet sectors of the trenches, men would trap rats. These weren't the disease-ridden creatures of popular imagination. Well, some of them were. But soldiers had learned which areas had rats that seemed healthier and less likely to carry disease. They'd fashion elaborate traps using bent wire and bait. Once caught, the rats would be cooked over makeshift fires deep in the dugouts. Was this safe? Absolutely not. Was it a significant source of nutrition? Probably not, but it gave men something to do, and more importantly, it gave them the psychological boost of having some agency over their food supply. They weren't just passively accepting what was given to them. They were taking action. They were hunting. They were doing something, anything, to fight back against the system that was slowly starving them. Some soldiers also became expert at identifying edible plants that grew near the trenches. Wild sorrel, dandelion greens, various roots. They'd gather these during quiet periods and add them to their stews. The nutritional value was probably minimal, but the variety, the sense of eating something green and fresh, was psychologically invaluable. It was a connection to the normal world, to agriculture, to the earth as something that produced life rather than death. And then there's the matter of cooking. In the frontline trenches, cooking was extremely restricted. Open fires were impossible because they'd give away positions to snipers. So most cooking had to happen in the support trenches or rear areas, and the food had to be transported forward in insulated containers. These containers were notoriously leaky and inefficient. Hot food would arrive cold. Carefully prepared stews would slosh around and become unpalatable mush. Men developed techniques to reheat food using small spirit lamps that produced minimal smoke. But these were unreliable and sometimes dangerous. There are multiple reports of soldiers being burned by overturned lamps or being poisoned by fumes in poorly ventilated dugouts. The dream of the hot meal became almost mythological in the trenches. Soldiers fantasized about it endlessly. They'd describe in excruciating detail what they'd eat when they got home. They'd share recipes they remembered from childhood. They'd make pacts with each other about meeting up after the war and cooking massive meals together. Some of these friendships survived the war, and those men actually did meet up and cook those meals. But many didn't survive. Many of those conversations were the last real human connection those soldiers experienced before they died. Alone and terrified in some muddy crater, the effect of chronic malnutrition on frontline troops was catastrophic. Beyond just the obvious weight loss and weakness, it made men more susceptible to disease. It reduced their ability to fight infection. It made their wounds more likely to become infected. It contributed to the psychological deterioration that came from spending weeks or months in the trenches. A man with a full belly might be able to maintain morale and discipline. A starving man loses his mental resilience. He becomes obsessed with food. He becomes susceptible to despair. There's a recorded testimony from a soldier named Harold Macmillan, who would later become a politician, describing his experience in the trenches during the Somme. He talks about the hunger as being as much of an enemy as the Germans. He describes moments where he'd be so hungry that he'd hallucinate food. He'd be standing in the trench and he'd suddenly smell his mother's kitchen. He'd close his eyes and be transported home for a moment before the sounds of artillery would drag him back to reality. These weren't flights of fancy. These were documented symptoms of malnutrition and the psychological stress of trench warfare. Now let's move on to what soldiers drank. Because hydration, and specifically what men drank to stay hydrated in the trenches, is just as fascinating and just as revealing about the daily reality of frontline life as food was. Water was everywhere in the trenches. and yet it was almost universally contaminated. The trenches were built in whatever terrain was available, and that terrain was often low-lying and prone to flooding. After heavy rains, the trenches would fill with water that was contaminated with everything you can imagine: human waste, animal remains, chemical residue from explosions, mud, and potentially disease-carrying organisms. Drinking untreated water from the trenches was a one-way ticket to serious gastrointestinal illness. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers suffered from dysentery, gastroenteritis, and cholera during the war. These diseases didn't kill as many soldiers as bullets and shrapnel did, but they incapacitated huge numbers of men and made them useless in combat. So water had to be supplied through organized logistics. But like food, water faced the same supply line challenges. In quiet periods, men could maintain adequate hydration, but during active operations, especially during major offensives, the water supply would often break down completely. Men would go days without adequate water. They'd become severely dehydrated while standing in mud that was hip deep. This combination created a kind of surreal torture. The irony was brutal and psychologically crushing. To deal with this, the British Army issued each soldier with a water bottle. These were metal bottles, usually holding about a liter of water, and they were essential equipment. But a single water bottle wasn't nearly enough for a man doing physical labor in all conditions for 12 hours a day or longer. Soldiers developed strategies. They'd position men near drainage points where slightly cleaner water might collect. They'd dig small wells behind the trenches. Some units had access to mobile water tankers that would supply water in large containers, and men would fill their water bottles from these. But during the worst periods of the war, especially in the Somme in 1916, water became so scarce that soldiers were actually reduced to collecting water from shell craters that had just been filled by rain. This is where alcohol comes in. And here's something that absolutely nobody talks about in the romanticized versions of World War I. Soldiers drank a lot. Alcohol was not just available. It was, in many cases, actively encouraged by the military command. This might sound crazy, but there's an actual logic to it. Alcohol is calories. In a calorie-deprived environment, that matters. Alcohol is also a depressant and an anxiety reducer. Before going over the top in a major attack, soldiers were often issued with rum. This wasn't just about courage. It was about reducing the overwhelming fear and panic that would otherwise make it impossible for men to function. The British Army officially issued rum rations to soldiers in the trenches, particularly during winter and during periods of heavy combat. A standard rum ration was about 2 tablespoons, which works out to roughly 40 milliliters. For a starving, freezing soldier, this was genuinely valued nutrition and warmth. Soldiers would sip the rum slowly, trying to make it last, feeling it warm their stomachs and their bones. But the distribution of rum was chaotic and often corrupt. Rum bottles would go missing in transit. Some officers would water down the rum before distributing it. Other officers, especially the better ones, would fiercely protect the rum ration and make sure every man got his fair share. The quality of the rum was variable. Some of it was proper naval rum that was actually quite good. Other batches were barely drinkable. There's a recorded account of soldiers discovering that a shipment of rum had been stored next to chemical supplies and had absorbed chemical flavors. They drank it anyway. They were that desperate for alcohol. Because alcohol, beyond just the immediate effects, represented something psychologically important. It represented that the high command acknowledged that men were suffering and were doing something, anything, to help. And then there was the homemade alcohol. This is where the story gets really interesting. Despite being against regulations, soldiers brewed their own alcohol in the trenches and in the rear areas. They'd use anything available. Sugar and water could be fermented into a kind of crude wine. Bread could be fermented to create something vaguely beer-like. Soldiers would create elaborate stills from whatever materials they could scavenge. They'd hide these operations in dugouts and remote corners of the trench system, and they'd trade the results with other units. This homemade alcohol was often dangerous. It could cause serious illness. It could contain toxic compounds, but it also represented the soldiers' determination to maintain some kind of normalcy, some kind of control over their environment. It was rebellion against the system. It was proof that even in the depths of the trenches, with death all around them, soldiers could still create something. They could still exercise agency. They could still be human in ways that weren't dictated by military hierarchy and regulation. Beyond rum and homemade alcohol, there was also the matter of tea. Oh, the tea. British soldiers loved their tea. It was one of the great constants of trench life. Almost every dugout or trench position would have access to a heat source capable of boiling water, even if it was just a small spirit lamp hidden behind sandbags. Soldiers would brew strong, dark tea, usually heavily sweetened with sugar, and sometimes with condensed milk if it was available. This tea served multiple purposes. It was hydration. It was calories from the sugar. It was psychological comfort. It was a connection to home and normalcy. The ritual of making tea was important. Even in the midst of shelling and chaos, soldiers would find time to brew tea. Officers would sometimes call unofficial truces during lulls in fighting specifically so that tea could be made and distributed. There's a famous account from a unit that was under heavy bombardment during the Somme. The soldiers were terrified, exhausted, shells falling all around them, and their sergeant, despite the chaos, took time to brew tea. When the men asked him if it was safe, he reportedly said something along the lines of, "If we're going to die today, we'll die with a cup of tea in us." He brewed the tea. He distributed it to every man, and it became a moment of humanity and defiance in the face of industrial slaughter. Soldiers also had access to coffee, though not always of good quality. Chicory coffee was common, and while it wasn't as popular as tea, it was still valued as something warm and comforting. There were also various cocoa and chocolate beverages, though these were rarer and often only appeared in care packages from home or in the rations of officers. Now, beyond the question of what soldiers had to drink officially, there's also the complex history of soldiers' access to local alcohol in areas where the trenches weren't too far from inhabited towns. In some sectors, soldiers could get into nearby villages during leave periods, and they'd drink local wine or beer. Sometimes this was tolerated by officers. Sometimes it was strictly forbidden, but men found ways. They'd sneak out. They'd trade with locals. They'd form complex social networks that extended even into combat zones. In quiet sectors, locals would sometimes sell alcohol to soldiers who ventured out at night. These transactions were illegal and dangerous, but they happened constantly. The relationship between alcohol and trench warfare is one of the most complex and revealing aspects of the war. Alcohol was simultaneously a tool of command, a form of self-medication for soldiers dealing with trauma, a means of creating camaraderie and bonding between soldiers, a source of comfort and escape, and a vector for discipline problems and dangerous behavior. Officers had to balance these concerns constantly. They needed men slightly drunk enough to be brave and slightly loose enough to forget their fear, but not so drunk that they became reckless or unable to follow orders. This balance was almost never struck perfectly. There were incidents of drunken soldiers being court-martialed, and executed for cowardice or disobedience when they were actually simply drunk. There were incidents of drunk soldiers making catastrophic tactical errors that got their units surrounded and destroyed. But there were also moments where drunkenness was the only thing that kept men sane enough to function. The soldier who was too terrified to think straight would have a drink and suddenly become capable of operating as a fighting unit. This is the uncomfortable reality that official histories often gloss over. Now let's talk about what soldiers dreamed about, because dreams, imagination, and the psychological life of soldiers in the trenches is just as important to understanding the war as the physical facts about food and water are. Sleep in the trenches was difficult, fragmented, and often haunted by nightmares. But even troubled sleep gave soldiers moments of escape. They dreamed about home. They dreamed about food. They dreamed about their families and friends. They dreamed about a time before the war when life was normal and the world made sense. The letters and diaries that have survived from the war period reveal the extent to which soldiers' fantasy lives became increasingly elaborate as the war ground on. Men would develop extremely detailed fantasies about what they'd do when they got home. A soldier might fantasize about a specific meal for hours at a time, describing in perfect detail every element of it. Not just what the food would taste like, but what the table would look like, who would be present, what he'd wear, what the weather would be like outside the window. This wasn't just nostalgia. It was a form of psychological survival. By firmly anchoring themselves to memories of home and fantasies of return, soldiers could maintain a sense of continuous self across the gap between civilian life and the nightmare of trench warfare. Some soldiers used their imagination to create elaborate stories and narratives that they'd share with their comrades. One unit is recorded to have had a soldier who, every evening during quiet periods, would tell a serialized story about a fictional soldier who went home, got married, opened a pub, and lived a quiet, happy life. Night after night, this soldier would continue the story, and other soldiers would gather to listen. It became a ritual. It became a form of collective dreaming. When this soldier was killed in an attack, the men in his unit continued the story themselves, each adding their own variations and details. They finished the story together, making sure that the fictional soldier got his happy ending, even if they knew their own lives probably wouldn't. Soldiers also dreamed about revenge, victory, and the end of the war. Many soldiers harbored fantasies about what they'd do to the enemy if they ever got the chance. These fantasies were often violent and vengeful, which isn't surprising given what these men had experienced and were continuing to experience. But interestingly, surveys and accounts suggest that most soldiers, even after experiencing horrific conditions and the deaths of comrades, actually harbored relatively few genuine desires for revenge against individual German soldiers. They recognized that the enemy soldiers were just as trapped, just as hungry, and just as much victims of the system as they were. What soldiers did fantasize about was the abstract victory, the end of the war. They dreamed about what the world would be like after the war ended. Some imagined radical social changes. Some imagined returning to exactly how things were before. Some imagined leaving Europe entirely and starting new lives in America or the colonies or anywhere else. The variability of these fantasies is remarkable. It shows that soldiers weren't a monolithic group. They had individual hopes and dreams and visions of the future. The psychological coping mechanisms that soldiers developed were extraordinary. Men who were facing the possibility of death or maiming on a daily basis developed what might be called an inversion of normal psychological function. They became almost superstitious. They develop individual rituals or habits that they believed kept them safe. One soldier wouldn't enter a trench from the left side. Another always touched a particular sandbag before going over the top. Another would recite a specific prayer or poem before missions. These weren't signs of weakness or breakdown. These were signs of people trying to exert some kind of control in an environment where control was almost impossible. There's also the phenomenon that historians have called gallows humor. The jokes that soldiers told in the trenches were often extremely dark. Jokes about death, mutilation, specific officers, the general absurdity of the war. This humor served a crucial psychological function. It acknowledged the reality of the situation while simultaneously maintaining enough emotional distance to function. A soldier could laugh about the horrible conditions while still dealing with the horrible conditions. The humor didn't mean he wasn't suffering. It meant he was developing ways to bear the suffering. The dreams and fantasies that soldiers maintained also served another function. They maintained individual identity and humanity. The military tried to strip soldiers of individual identity. They were reduced to numbers. They wore identical uniforms. They were addressed by rank and last name, not by their given names. In the trenches, men were sometimes referred to by their unit number rather than their name, but their dreams and fantasies were uniquely theirs. No one could strip those away. No one could order you to stop fantasizing about your mother's cooking or your sweetheart's smile. Those psychological spaces were sacred and inviolable. Many soldiers also engaged in elaborate fantasy conversations with the people they loved. A soldier might spend an entire hour fantasizing about a conversation with his wife or girlfriend or mother, imagining every word she'd say and every word he'd say in response. These conversations were often more vivid and more emotionally real than actual conversations had been before the war. Men would revise these conversations over and over, trying different approaches, different words, as if they were preparing for some interview that mattered more than anything else in the world. Because in a way it did. That reunion, that conversation, was the promise that kept them going. What's remarkable about examining these intimate details of trench life is how clearly they reveal the shared humanity that transcended the massive organized violence of the war. Individual German soldiers were experiencing the same hunger, the same desperate need for warmth, the same hunger for meaning and connection that British soldiers experienced. They were drinking similar rations of inferior alcohol. They were eating similar rations of inedible food. They were having similar dreams about home and families. The war created a kind of strange equality in misery. This is where we start to see stories of temporary truces and moments of connection between enemies. The most famous example is the Christmas Truce of 1914, where soldiers along parts of the Western Front spontaneously agreed to stop fighting, met in no man's land, exchanged cigarettes and chocolate, and sang carols together. This wasn't officially sanctioned. It was the act of exhausted, hungry, traumatized young men recognizing their shared humanity and taking a brief moment to acknowledge it. There were also longer periods of informal truce in certain sectors where the front line remained relatively static. Soldiers on both sides understood that if they didn't shoot at the enemy wouldn't shoot at them. Snipers would maintain unofficial territories where they wouldn't target anyone, but if someone came into their zone, they'd be killed. This created a bizarre equilibrium where, despite ostensibly being at war, soldiers could sometimes go weeks or months in relatively safe conditions, just waiting and watching and maintaining the fiction of conflict. These moments of connection and informal peace were probably rarer than popular accounts suggest, but they did happen, and they reveal something essential about human nature. Even in the midst of war, even when trained and ordered to kill, Soldiers maintained the capacity for empathy and connection. The hunger they felt, the dreams they had, the desire for warmth and comfort and meaning transcended national boundaries. The question of what soldiers ate, drank, and dreamed is ultimately a question about what it means to remain human in inhuman circumstances. It's about how people maintain their sense of self when institutions and systems try to strip that self away. It's about the small acts of resistance and agency that let people endure impossible situations. It's about how a cup of tea can be an act of defiance, how sharing a meal can be an act of love, how dreams and fantasies can be a form of survival. The soldiers of World War I were not the romantic figures of popular imagination. They weren't heroes in some abstract sense. They were young men, many of them barely out of their teens, who were trapped in a system that was designed to kill them. Some managed to escape, some were killed. Many who survived were permanently damaged physically and psychologically, but all of them were remarkably human. They tried to make their suffering meaningful. They tried to help their fellow soldiers. They tried to maintain connections to the world they came from, and they did all of this while dealing with chronic hunger, constant danger, and the knowledge that tomorrow might be the day they died. The food they ate was terrible, but they shared it with their friends. The water they drank was often contaminated, but they celebrated when it was clean. The alcohol they consumed was sometimes dangerous, but it brought moments of connection and relief. The dreams they had were sometimes impossible, but they were also what kept them moving forward. One day at a time, one meal at a time, one cup of tea at a time. When we remember the soldiers of World War I, we often remember them through statistics. 2 million men died on the Western Front. 7 million were wounded. But these numbers don't capture the reality. The reality is contained in the small, intimate details of daily life. The reality is a soldier brewing tea under shell fire. The reality is a sergeant sharing his ration with a younger soldier who's too traumatized to open his own. The reality is young men dreaming about home while sitting in mud, rats scurrying past them in the darkness, the distant sound of artillery rumbling on the horizon. Understanding what soldiers ate, drank and dreamed isn't just academic historical interest. It's a way of understanding how human beings cope with and endure the most extreme circumstances. It's a way of understanding the connection between the personal and the political, between individual suffering and massive institutional systems that create that suffering. It's a way of understanding that even in war, humans remain capable of loyalty, friendship, humor, and imagination. The trenches of World War I were hell, but they were hell populated by human beings who tried, often successfully, to maintain their humanity. But there's more to this story, because while we've talked about the basic physical realities of feeding and hydrating soldiers in the trenches, there's an entire hidden world of personal experience that rarely makes it into the official historical record. This is the world captured in letters home, in private diaries, in recorded testimonies given decades after the war ended. This is where we find the true, unvarnished reality of what it meant to be a human being in those trenches. Let's talk about something specific. The letters from home. These weren't just communication. They were lifelines. Soldiers would receive letters and parcels from their families, and these items carried an almost sacred importance. A letter from home could sustain a man psychologically through weeks of misery. A package containing food from home could be treasured and rationed over days or even weeks. There's a documented case of a soldier named William who received a package from his mother containing homemade biscuits and jam and a knitted sweater. This package had taken 6 weeks to arrive, and by the time it reached him, William had been in the trenches for 2 months straight without leave. The first thing he did was put on the sweater. Then he broke off a single biscuit and ate it very slowly, making it last for over an hour. His fellow soldiers watched him eat that biscuit like it was the most important meal they'd ever seen. One of them later wrote in his diary that watching William eat that biscuit from his mother had moved him to tears. It represented something. It represented that there was a world outside the trenches. It represented that people at home remembered them. It represented love and connection in a place where those things seemed impossible. The impact of not receiving letters or packages was equally profound, but in a devastating way. Soldiers who didn't have families or whose families couldn't afford to send parcels would experience a kind of despair that went beyond the normal misery of trench life. To receive nothing while watching your friends receive packages and letters was to be made to feel that you were forgotten, that you didn't matter, that nobody at home cared whether you lived or died. This psychological wound was sometimes worse than physical wounds. There's a recorded testimony from a soldier named Thomas who spent 3 years in the trenches and received only 2 letters from home during that entire time. He described the experience of seeing other soldiers receive parcels and watching them share the contents with their friends while he received nothing. He said it made him feel like a ghost, like he'd already died and nobody at home had noticed. He survived the war physically, but he was profoundly broken psychologically. The combination of physical deprivation and psychological abandonment was catastrophic. Now let's talk about the seasonal changes and how they affected daily life in the trenches. Because the experience of being in the trenches in summer was fundamentally different from being in them in winter, and these seasonal changes had massive impacts on what soldiers ate, what they drank, and what they dreamed about. Winter in the trenches was a special kind of hell. Temperatures could drop to 10 or 15 degrees below freezing, especially in the worst winters of 1916 and 1917. Men's feet would freeze. Soldiers would develop trench foot, a condition where the constant exposure to cold, wet conditions would cause the blood vessels in their feet to constrict, cutting off circulation and causing tissue death. Thousands of soldiers were evacuated from the trenches every winter because of trench foot. Some lost their toes, some lost entire feet. The condition was often more debilitating than a combat wound because it was preventable with proper care, which made it feel like a personal failure to soldiers who developed it, even though the reality was that the conditions were so brutal that prevention was almost impossible. The food situation in winter was even worse than in other seasons, because the supply system broke down even more completely due to mud, ice, and snow. Rations would arrive frozen solid. A tin of bully beef that arrived frozen couldn't be opened. It had to be thawed somehow, and the methods available in the trenches were crude and inefficient. Men would try to thaw tins by holding them close to their bodies, or by immersing them in warm water from the one heat source available. Sometimes the tins would burst during the thawing process, and the contents would be lost. The tea ritual became even more important in winter. A cup of hot tea wasn't just hydration or calories, it was survival. Holding the tin cup in your hands provided warmth. Drinking the hot liquid warmed you from the inside out. Men would nurse a cup of tea for much longer than made sense just to preserve the warmth. The psychological importance of that warmth was immense. A soldier who was shaking with cold could hold a cup of tea and for a few minutes feel almost human again. Winter was also when soldiers' dreams about home became most intense. Men would fantasize about winter at home. Not war-torn Europe, but their homes, their families, warm rooms with fireplaces, hot meals, comfort. These fantasies would be extremely detailed and emotionally vivid. A A soldier might spend hours fantasizing about sitting by a fire, wrapped in a blanket, drinking hot cocoa. The fantasy would be so real that when he snapped back to the reality of the freezing trenches, the pain of the contrast would be almost unbearable. Summer, by contrast, brought different horrors. The temperature could soar, and the trenches became breeding grounds for disease. The smell was absolutely overwhelming. With thousands of men living in close quarters with minimal sanitation, with human waste stored in latrine buckets, with decaying animal corpses sometimes frozen in the mud from winter, and now beginning to decompose, the stench was almost physical. Soldiers described it as something you could almost chew. Veterans who survived the war would later describe the smell of the trenches as the thing they remembered most vividly, even decades later. Summer was also when the rats thrived. The trenches would become infested with enormous rats that grew fat on the available food sources and dead bodies. These weren't small rats. These were animals the size of a man's fist or larger. They would crawl over sleeping soldiers. They'd infest the food supplies. They'd nest in the dugouts and burrows that soldiers had excavated. The relationship between soldiers and rats is one of the most revealing aspects of trench life. Soldiers hated the rats, but they also developed a grudging respect for them. The rats were survivors, just like the soldiers. They'd adapted to the trenches and were thriving in conditions that were killing humans. Some soldiers started leaving scraps of food out for the rats, not out of kindness, but because a rat that was occupied eating scraps was a rat that wasn't crawling over you at night. The food in summer didn't actually improve much, but the psychological experience of eating it was different. Meat spoils faster in summer heat. Bully beef that was barely palatable in winter could become actively dangerous in summer. Canned vegetables would ferment and gas would build up inside the tins, causing them to explode when opened. Soldiers had to be extremely careful opening canned goods in summer. There are accounts of soldiers being sprayed with fermented vegetable matter that had built up pressure inside cans for weeks. The drinking water situation was also worse in summer. Stagnant water in shell craters would become breeding grounds for mosquitoes and other insects. Dysentery rates spiked in summer. What had been a serious problem in winter became epidemic in summer. Soldiers would be unable to leave the trenches for latrine duty, which would lead to them defeating themselves in place, which would further contaminate the water supply, which would spread more disease. It was a vicious cycle that the military struggled to break. But summer also brought one advantage. Food from home was more likely to arrive in edible condition. Parcels that were sent in summer were less likely to be frozen or waterlogged by months of travel. And summer meant the possibility of leave, of getting out of the trenches for a few days or weeks. The dream of leave was almost as powerful as the dream of going home permanently. A few days away from the trenches, sleeping in a bed, eating regular meals, being able to walk without fear of being shot by a sniper, seeing civilians going about normal life. These things were almost impossible to imagine when you were in the trenches. But the possibility of them, however remote, was enough to sustain some soldiers. Now let's talk about the system of leave and how this affected soldiers' psychological states. The British Army, despite its reputation for being brutal and uncaring about soldiers' welfare, actually did institute a leave system. Soldiers who served at the front for a certain period would be rotated back to the rear areas or even sent home on leave. This system was designed to preserve morale and prevent complete psychological collapse. But the system was often chaotic and inconsistent. Some soldiers would get leave regularly. Others would go months or years without getting leave. Soldiers in quiet sectors of the front would get leave more easily than soldiers in active combat zones. This created resentment and a sense of unfairness that was psychologically damaging. The soldiers who did get leave would often undergo a kind of psychological disorientation when they arrived home. They'd been living in a world of constant danger, scarcity, and filth for months. Suddenly they were in a world where food was abundant, where people wore clean clothes, where nobody was trying to kill them. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. Soldiers described the experience of being on leave as almost more traumatic than being in the trenches because they had to return. The knowledge that the leave was temporary, that they'd have to go back to the trenches, made the comfort of home feel torturous rather than comforting. There's a famous account from an officer who went on leave and returned home to find his younger brother had gone deaf from scarlet fever while he was away. The family hadn't told him in letters because they didn't want to worry him. When he discovered this, he fell into a deep depression. He'd been surviving the trenches partly by fantasizing about returning home and seeing everything the same as he'd left it. The discovery that the world had changed, that his family had suffered in his absence, shattered something in him. He returned to the trenches and was killed 6 months later. This is an important aspect of soldiers' psychology that often gets overlooked. They didn't just dream about getting home. They dreamed about getting home and everything being exactly as they'd left it. The idea that life had continued without them, that people had aged and changed and suffered in their absence, was psychologically devastating. It meant that they couldn't actually go home because the home they'd left no longer existed. Let's talk about religion and spirituality in the trenches, because faith, or the loss of faith, was an enormous part of soldiers' experience. Before the war, the majority of soldiers would have identified as Christian and would have believed in God. But the trenches challenged faith in ways that were almost impossible to overcome. How could God allow this suffering? This was the fundamental question that haunted soldiers. They'd see friends blown to pieces by artillery. They'd watch men die slowly from infected wounds. They'd see young men, barely 18 years old, traumatized beyond repair. And they'd ask where God was in all of this. Many soldiers lost their faith entirely in the trenches, but others found that faith became even more important, more necessary. They'd pray before going over the top. They'd recite prayers or hymns when they were terrified. They'd find comfort in religious ritual, even if they'd stopped believing in the theological content of those rituals. There's a remarkable account from a chaplain who served in the trenches and who recorded conversations with dying soldiers. Almost all of them, regardless of whether they'd been religious before the war, asked for prayer or religious comfort as they were dying. The impulse to seek spiritual comfort in the face of death was almost universal. Whether soldiers believed in an afterlife or just wanted to feel connected to something larger than themselves and the immediate horror of their situation, faith offered something. Some soldiers developed elaborate superstitions and pseudo-religious rituals. They'd carry lucky charms. They'd perform specific actions before going into combat. They'd recite words or phrases that they believed would protect them. From a psychological perspective, these superstitions served an important function. They gave soldiers a sense of agency and control in a situation where they actually had almost no control. If a soldier believed that carrying a specific object would keep him alive, then he had some power to influence his own fate. The superstition was false, but the psychological benefit was real. Now let's move into something even more intimate and more revealing about the human experience in the trenches. The relationships between soldiers, particularly the intense friendships and sometimes romantic relationships that formed between men who were living in conditions of extreme stress and potential death Soldiers in the trenches formed bonds that were unlike anything most of them had experienced in civilian life. These weren't just friendships. They were relationships that transcended normal friendship because they involved absolute dependence on another person for survival. When you're in a trench and artillery is falling and your closest friend is beside you, your life literally depends on him staying beside you and doing his job. These relationships had an intensity and a depth that is almost impossible for people who haven't experienced combat to understand. Men would develop complete emotional and physical intimacy with their close friends. They'd share everything. They'd share food, even when they were starving. They'd share blankets and body heat in winter. They'd hold each other while crying. They'd tell each other things they'd never told anyone else. They'd share fantasies and dreams and fears and hopes. For many soldiers, their closest friend in the trenches was the most important person in their life. More important than family members they'd known all their lives. And then one day, that friend would be killed. This happened constantly. Soldiers would wake up and find that the man who'd been sleeping next to them, sharing a blanket for warmth, had been killed by a sniper or by overnight shelling. Or they'd watch the man die slowly over hours or days. Or they'd find only pieces of him. And they'd have to go on. They'd have to continue living and fighting and eating and sleeping, knowing that their most important relationship had been severed. The cumulative effect of repeatedly losing close friends was devastating. Soldiers who survived long enough developed what we'd now recognize as PTSD. Though it wasn't called that at the time, they called it shell shock or trench shock or neurasthenia. The symptoms included nightmares, flashbacks, inability to sleep, extreme anxiety, emotional numbness, and sometimes complete psychological breakdown. Soldiers who'd survived multiple years in the trenches would sometimes simply stop functioning. They'd sit and stare at nothing. They'd be unable to respond to commands. They'd be evacuated to hospitals where they'd often spend the rest of the war unable to function. There were also jokes about specific people. Officers who were particularly disliked would be the subject of cruel jokes. Soldiers who'd been killed would become figures in ongoing narratives of dark humor. There's a recorded account of a unit that developed an ongoing joke about a soldier who'd been killed by a shell. They gave his ghost a name and personality and would reference him constantly. What would old Bill think about that? Or Bill's been here. Look at the trench he made. This humor wasn't mean-spirited despite how it sounds. It was a way of keeping the person present while acknowledging the reality of his death. It was a way of honoring him and processing grief simultaneously. The psychological resilience of soldiers in the trenches was remarkable. Human beings, it turns out, are capable of adapting to almost anything. They can get used to horror. They can normalize conditions that should be unlivable. They can maintain hope and even joy in circumstances where hope and joy seem completely impossible. This wasn't because soldiers were special or superhuman. It was because humans are capable of extraordinary adaptation when survival is at stake. There's also a crucial psychological mechanism that soldiers developed that relates specifically to food and eating. In situations of scarcity, psychological relationship to food changes. Food becomes not just nutrition, but also ritual, comfort, and control. A soldier who'd learned to make a single biscuit last for hours wasn't just stretching his rations. He was creating a structure and ritual that gave his day meaning. He was exercising control in a situation where he had no control. He was creating moments of mindfulness and attention in a life that was otherwise characterized by chaos and horror. Some soldiers developed elaborate systems for consuming their rations. They'd always eat their biscuits before their bully beef. They'd save their jam for last. They'd portion out their daily ration into specific amounts for each meal and snack time. These systems didn't provide any nutritional advantage. They were purely psychological. They created predictability and structure in an unpredictable, structureless environment. Let's also talk about what happened when soldiers did get access to fresh food. In quiet periods, or when units were in the rear areas resting, soldiers might get access to fresh vegetables or fresh meat. These meals took on an almost ceremonial importance. Soldiers would look forward to them with an intensity that seems almost incomprehensible to people who've never experienced food scarcity. When a unit got access to fresh bread, it wasn't just eaten, it was celebrated. Men would gather and watch each other eat. They'd discuss the taste and texture and quality in excruciating detail. Some soldiers kept diaries where they'd record every fresh meal they ate and describe it in detail. These descriptions are often more vividly written and more emotionally intense than their descriptions of combat or other major events. There's also a category of food that occupied a special place in soldiers' minds and dreams. Items of extreme scarcity or luxury. Chocolate, for instance. If a soldier received a bar of chocolate in a care package from home, it would be treasured beyond measure. He might not eat it immediately. He might carry it for weeks, protecting it carefully, deciding on the right moment to eat it. When he finally did eat it, the experience would be so emotionally significant that it would be recorded in letters or diaries, with language that seems out of proportion to the simple act of eating a piece of chocolate. But it wasn't out of proportion, because eating that chocolate meant eating something that was connected to home, to normal life, to the world before the war. Similarly, alcohol took on extreme psychological importance beyond its actual physical effects. A few sips of rum from a care package or from trade with other soldiers could lift a man's mood for days. He'd remember the taste and quality and would anticipate getting another opportunity to drink something similar. Soldiers would develop preferences and would trade with each other to get specific types of alcohol. They'd talk about alcohol with a passion and detail that revealed how much they were thinking about comfort and escape and small moments of pleasure in their daily lives. Now, let's talk about something that reveals the incredible complexity and humanity of soldiers in the trenches. The trade systems and informal economies that developed. The trenches weren't just places of military hierarchy and order. They were also places where informal markets and trade systems thrived. Soldiers would trade goods with each other. A soldier who had a skill might trade that skill for food. A man who was good at sewing could repair uniforms and equipment in exchange for extra rations or tobacco. A man who could make things could create small items that other soldiers wanted. There's a recorded account of a soldier who became famous in his unit for making small wooden items. He'd carve pipes from wood. He'd make small boxes. He'd make chess pieces. Other soldiers would trade food or money or cigarettes to get these items. The wooden items weren't useful in any practical sense, but they represented beauty and craftsmanship in an environment of brutality and destruction. Cigarettes were also a form of currency. Soldiers who smoked would receive cigarettes in their rations, and these could be traded for other items. Soldiers developed complex trade networks where goods would flow through multiple intermediaries. A soldier might trade his cigarettes to a friend in exchange for extra bully beef, and his friend might trade those cigarettes to someone else in exchange for tobacco from a care package. These trade networks connected soldiers across the entire trench system and even extended into adjacent units. There was also trade with support troops and rear area soldiers. Frontline soldiers would trade with soldiers in supply units or with cooks in order to get better quality food or more of it. This required careful negotiation because it involved violating the official rationing system. Officers generally turned a blind eye to this trade because they understood that it improved morale. The official system was trying to provide equal rations to all soldiers. But in reality, different soldiers' needs were different. A man doing heavy labor in the front lines needed more calories than a man working in a supply depot. The informal trade system allowed soldiers to adapt the allocation of resources to their actual needs in ways that the official system couldn't. There was even trade with soldiers from other nations. In sectors where British and French trenches were adjacent, or where soldiers from other allied nations were nearby, there would be trade. French soldiers might trade wine for British tea. Canadian soldiers might trade different quality rations for other items. These international trade networks reveal that soldiers, despite being from different countries, recognized their common humanity and were willing to work together to improve their collective situation. And then there was trade with local civilians. In areas where the trenches were relatively close to inhabited towns or villages, soldiers would sometimes be able to trade with locals. They'd give money or cigarettes or military equipment in exchange for local food and alcohol. These transactions were officially forbidden, but they happened constantly. Officers would sometimes participate in this trade themselves. There's an account of an officer who organized regular supplies of fresh produce from a local village, and while he officially paid for it, he was also breaking regulations by establishing this arrangement. The existence of these trade networks reveals something essential about human nature. Even in a situation of scarcity and military hierarchy and potential death, humans will organize themselves to improve their situation. They'll develop economic systems. They'll establish relationships of mutual benefit. They'll find ways to create more equity and fairness than official systems provide. The trenches weren't just places of brutality and order. They were also places of creative adaptation and entrepreneurship. Let's talk about the psychological impact of specific locations and events within the trenches, because certain areas of the trenches took on almost mythological status in soldiers' minds. Certain shell craters became known as places where death was almost certain. Certain communication trenches became known as being safer. Certain latrine areas became known as places where snipers were active. Soldiers would develop elaborate knowledge systems about the geography of danger in their sector. During the major offensives, like the Somme or Passchendaele, soldiers would be aware that they were moving into areas that were known to be particularly deadly. They'd be moving into trenches where previous units had suffered massive casualties. The psychological impact of this knowledge was enormous. Men would go into these areas knowing, in many cases, that they were probably going to die, and yet they'd go anyway, not because they were brainwashed or hypnotized, but because that's what soldiers did. They followed orders. They participated in the unit. They tried to survive. This is where the fantasy and dreaming took on a special character. Before major offensives, soldiers would fantasize more intensely than ever. They'd write letters home. They'd make wills, leaving their few possessions to friends. They'd tell each other about the families they were going to go home to, the jobs they were going to take, the lives they were going to live. This wasn't naive optimism. These soldiers knew that many of them were going to die, but they maintained these fantasies anyway, because the fantasies were what allowed them to function, to go over the top, to do what they'd been ordered to do. And some of them did survive. Some of them did go home. Some of them did get to marry their girlfriends and have children and live the lives they'd fantasized about. But many didn't. Many of the letters they wrote were the last communication their families received from them. Many of the fantasies they'd described were never realized. This is getting close to the end of the story, but there's one more crucial element to discuss: the aftermath. What happened to soldiers when they came home? Because the experience of being in the trenches didn't end when the war ended. It continued for decades, in the form of trauma that didn't have a name, in the form of memories that wouldn't fade, in the form of relationships that were permanently altered by the experience. Veterans who returned home from the trenches would sometimes find that they couldn't eat. The psychological association between food and survival had been so intense, and the food had been so traumatic, that some soldiers developed aversions to eating. They'd sit in front of a plate of food and find themselves unable to consume it. Some would experience severe nausea when they saw certain types of food that reminded them of trench rations. Years later, some veterans would still refuse to eat bully beef or hard biscuits or even jam. The association was too strong. The memories were too vivid. Others would find that they couldn't sleep. They'd wake up at 4 in the morning, terrified, convinced that they were back in the trenches. They'd hear sounds and interpret them as artillery. A car backfiring would send them into a panic. A sudden noise would cause them to dive for cover. These symptoms persisted for years, decades for some veterans. Shell shock, as it was called, was a real phenomenon. A real injury to the brain and nervous system caused by the combination of physical trauma, sensory overload, and psychological stress. Some veterans would become obsessively concerned about food. They'd maintain large supplies of food in their homes. They'd refuse to eat certain foods because they wanted to preserve them. They'd experience anxiety about food availability even decades after the war, even in times of plenty. The scarcity of the trenches had created deep psychological wounds that manifested as an inability to trust that food would be available. But there's also a remarkable story of adaptation and healing. Many veterans did readjust to civilian life. They did get married and have families. They did enjoy the lives they'd fantasized about in the trenches. The fantasy of a hot meal, of fresh bread, of sleeping in a bed, of being able to walk outside without fear of being shot by a sniper. These fantasies did come true for many men, and many of them reported that the reality was even better than the fantasy. There are accounts of veterans who, when they got home, did indeed cook the meals they'd fantasized about. They'd sit down with their families and eat, and for a moment they'd be transported back to the trenches. They'd remember the friends who died. They'd remember the hunger, and then they'd look around at their families, at the abundance on the table, at the fact that nobody was trying to kill them, and they'd feel gratitude so intense it would bring tears to their eyes. Some veterans made a point of sharing their food with others. They'd remember the sharing and the bonds that had formed through sharing in the trenches. They'd feed their friends and their families with a generosity that sometimes seemed excessive to people who hadn't experienced trenches. They remembered what it meant to share when there was scarcity, and they wanted to honor that memory and the people it connected them to. The psychological weight of survival also affected many veterans. They'd survived when friends hadn't. They'd gotten home when thousands and thousands hadn't. This created a kind of psychological burden that some veterans carried for the rest of their lives. They'd have dreams about the friends they'd lost. They'd remember conversations with men who died. They'd carry a kind of grief that never fully resolved because the loss was so immense and so personal. And yet many veterans found meaning in this grief. They'd become advocates for veterans' welfare. They'd work for peace, trying to prevent future wars. They'd tell their stories, even though it was painful to relive the experiences. They'd mentor young men. They'd create communities of fellow veterans where they could share their experiences with people who understood. because they'd lived through the same things. Some veterans would gather regularly, decades after the war, specifically to share meals together. These meals took on a ceremonial importance. They'd cook together, they'd eat together, they'd remember together, they'd tell stories and jokes and share memories. The ritual of sharing a meal connected them back to the trenches, but in a way that was healing rather than traumatic. They were reclaiming the ritual of eating and sharing from the Conti.